I'd like to call this study session of Lakewood City Council for Monday, September 9th to order. First item for discussion is our joint meeting with the Landmarks and Heritage Advisory Board. Go over their work plan. Len Spieth, the chair, I'll kick it over to you to take off.
This year, it's been a productive year. Make sure you all hear that. Some years aren't as productive. Anyway, in January, the board elevated the first item on the work plan, created a program to designate hardscaping, including bridges, roads, historical landmarks. The board also made a recommendation to amend the existing application for the Lakewood landmarks in order to illustrate that hardscaping is a qualified landmark per the Lakewood Municipal Code, LMC 2.48.020, which defines historic research as a resource, as a district, site, building, structure. It can be a road or object with sufficient in American and or local history, architecture, archaeology, and or culture. We've engaged with the Youth Council for a couple of years now. Last year was an interesting time. We got some good participation for that. We have their regular attendance at our board meetings and invited them to join our consultants at the Northwest Room at the Tacoma Public Library while they were doing the research on the Oak Park neighborhood. That brings us to our most exciting accomplishment thus far, the Oak Park Reconnaissance Level Survey. So not all houses in that area were worthy of designation because there's been a lot of modifications through the years. Some things changed, garages have burned and been redone. So there's a number of things that didn't qualify. So I imagine there's a few people that were disappointed. However, there's a number of properties that can be designated. Whether they will or not, that's hard to say. All we can do is invite people. And that's what we've been doing with the study. Okay. Marjorie is going to give us more detail on that particular item. So I'll turn it over to her.
I said I would do that. The city received a $12,000 grant from the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. And we hired Northwest Vernacular to do a survey so that we could identify whether the Oak Park neighborhood was a neighborhood that might fit underneath historic preservation and be designated a historic neighborhood. And they did the survey. They did a fantastic job. They did indicate, I think it was 3 houses that actually fell underneath being able to be historically identified because they didn't have a lot of windows that were replaced. They had the original windows and they had all of the original stuff. The others had more renovations and things that are changed so that they wouldn't really qualify for a historic designation. And we had 3 meetings in which there were 10 to 25 people in there, depending on the meeting. And the last meeting, we had somebody from the Historic Society come and talk about the history from his perspective, which is geology kind of perspective. He did a lot of talking about lakes and how they have been preserved and when they were created and things like that. But the result of the survey came with a recommendation that we should have a community recognition, historic community recognition of the place, not by the Historic Society here in Lakewood, versus making them a historic designation, because there were so many houses that had other changes, but also that when you do a historic designation, then you're limited to certain buildings and developments in the development. And so that would leave that open for, let's see, I wrote it down. Oh, that was what that was. I'm sorry. Historic designation was what I was writing that down. But in other words, the point was that although those houses that didn't have the renovations can become, if the homeowners request, historic landmarks and historic designated houses, but the whole community is something that is more recognized as a community recognition by the Historic Society, and I think that was a good recommendation from their report. Now, they sent a report to the Archaeology and Historic Preservation group that gave us the grant, and there's copies of that are in Lakewood online, and there's some hard copies here in the community if you wanted to see more of that. They have pictures of each one of the houses and then a little blurb on each one of the houses, so it's a nice piece.
Questions?
We got more.
I just thought if there were any questions on that, we go to them now.
Any questions on what I said?
Yeah. Right. Mr. Whalen.
Well, I enjoyed reading the packet. I was, not being as intimately involved in this process as you folks are. I was curious to understand the rationale and the impetus to do a whole neighborhood. I've never seen that happen before, but it's kind of interesting. So how did that all come about?
You can, unless you want to talk about it, it's up to you. I'm sorry, but this is a community which is unique in its design and was happening in World War II, and at that time, they were doing a lot of experimenting of things like cement beams versus wooden beams. And so this community had this tract of land, its whole community or tract, I guess, was built in that manner. And so we wanted to know if that was something that would be appropriate to recognize as a historic part of Lakewood. And I do think that there is a lot to learn from how the houses have been able to be developed and how they've stood up to the weather here. And it also is laid out not strictly on the grid. It has like a curve. And so it's unique and charming in itself. So that's the reason why that was the one that was picked for this.
There's an entire section that were built within just a few years of each other, and they're poured concrete. And so they're very unusual architecturally. You don't see them a lot anywhere. And to just have that whole neighborhood with, it's very obviously visible on a map. You can see it because of the curved streets. And then the other houses on the other side of Bridgeport, you can tell that they're kind of related, even though the structures are different, because it has that same curved street design. They're almost mirrors of each other. So it's quite interesting. And the poured concrete houses are just very unique in the way that they look also. They look almost kind of like fairy tale cottages. So, and I grew up in Lakewood, and I had a friend who lived in that neighborhood, and those houses are, I call them TARDIS houses, because they look very small, but they live bigger on the inside. So they're kind of neat little houses. And even with as much renovation as has gone on since they were built, you can still see the bones of them in that neighborhood when you walk through there. They just are very unique, the roof lines and the sizes and everything. You can still see them. And so it's very neat. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I do my part. So, but they're just, it was a really cool neighborhood. So that's why we decided to look at it.
These are some of the first and small amount of houses that were built with cement foundation, I mean,
Well, they're
beams
poured
and
concrete. The
poured
entire house
concrete,
is
yeah.
poured concrete. So
So
they have a little
that's
bit of
unique.
kind of clapboard decoration on the top part. So it was kind of funny because when the Northwest Vernacular people were talking about it, they were talking about the stucco exterior. And Glenn and I are both sitting there going, it's concrete, it's concrete. It's why they're cool. So, but yeah, they're just neat little houses.
Right? To go back to your question originally, could we designate that area? And I think that that's possible because you could give a community landmark designation to the district to give it some honor that wouldn't ordinarily be there. There's a few people in the area that would probably appreciate that. There's a few that may not. It's hard to say. It isn't a binding legal requirement. They don't have to do anything. They could just get a historic marker saying this is the Oak Park district. It was designated as a community landmark in such and such a time. And once we get back to some historic markers, that'll come along.
Okay. And you indicated that there are only a couple of places that, or a couple of actual residences that you thought would be eligible for designation. You set those out?
Yeah, I don't remember like which addresses there are, but I think there's 3 of them that are almost perfectly intact. And so you can really see how the whole neighborhood looked, you know, like in the 50s. But most of them, I mean, they're basically, they have new windows, and some of them have an attached garage that they didn't have before, and some of them have an enormous unattached garage where it's almost as big as the house and it's in the back, and you're like, ooh, that's kind of different. And that is not how the neighborhood looked originally, but it's okay, you can ignore it.
As a child of the 50s, it kind of raises my hackles when I'm considered eligible for a historic designation. Mr. Brasfitter.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. In the survey, one of the things that was noted regarding the character of this neighborhood was the proliferation of almost every lot having a Gary Oak.
There are a lot of them.
And it, now the survey, the person who did the survey wrote in the survey that the Gary Oaks in this neighborhood were protected by city ordinance. And I'm not sure that that's as accurate at this point in time, because this is a neighborhood with smaller lot sizes, and our tree preservation is something that we talk about a lot in terms of cover, but that most of the protection is for the tree canopy on lots over a certain size, and beyond that, it's sort of at the discretion of owners. But if you and we were to move forward with a designation of the community under the concept of a historically significant suburban development, would it be something that you would consider asking the council to take a look at our current tree preservation ordinance and make a unique element of it to preserve the Gary Oaks in this neighborhood, despite the small lot sizes? Or is that not as significant as maybe the person doing the survey who had to write things anyway did?
I don't think that they were focusing on the Gary Oaks when they did the survey. They were mainly looking at the integrity of the buildings and how many were truly original and how many had been modified through the years. And it's the number that have been modified through the years is rather significant. You can look at the trees whatever way you want, but I think most everybody now in Lakewood values the Gary Oaks and will try to save them if they can. However, they're getting up in age, and some of them aren't the most healthy by now. And I don't know where you get some seedlings, but I suppose that's an easy solution to replace them.
Well, while we have a lot of older residents who value the Gary Oaks, I think younger residents value Gary Oaks too. So I think that the age of people is not so significant with respect to them. In reading the survey, I noted that they pointed out that there was, most of the Gary Oaks had largely been retained, and they thought it significant enough to mention. All right, thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Next,
What was that?
back to you.
About the Gary Oaks again?
No, we're talking about
Oh.
historical preservation. That's about tree preservation, which is a different subject.
Well,
So
I
like
think
to
that
like to
that's-
move on.
that's fine
on-
if the
on
city-
your report as to your work plan.
Is
I
interested. Do
think
you
it's
have
up to my
another,
bit now.
do you have another item, Beth?
I got a whole bit. All right, so one of the other things that was on our agenda to take care of this year was we started talking about a historic streets plan. It's part of what Glenn was talking about early on about having things besides just buildings, being able to be designated and stuff. And so we were looking at that and what could we do? And there was an opportunity to apply for a grant. It's the 2020 Pierce County Historic Preservation Grant. And we're looking at that to fund the cost of street signs for a historic streets recognition program, because that's just really easy. You put them out there, and basically what you do is you find your historic streets and you put a brown sign up instead of the usual green, and it just kind of lets all the history geeks in the world know that that is a historic street, because they all know brown is the universal color of historic stuff. It just is. Yeah, and our grant request was for $4,850, and that money would go towards the purchase of the signs and installation hardware, and we came up with a grand total of 73 signs on 11 different streets of various local and state significance. I mean, we have part of Washington Road #1 running through Lakewood, but we also have a historic racetrack. So there are all sorts of interesting stuff like that. So Glenn and Marjorie and I and one of our other members went to the Pierce County Historic Preservation Review for that. And they recommended us for 50% funding. They had more projects than they had money. And so they're trying to figure out how to get the best use they could out of the monies that they had and give as many people as they could something for their projects. So we're not gonna hear about it until November to find out how much we actually got, but we'll see. Yeah, so we don't know for sure yet. So, and that lets me segue into another thing that I found out about recently. So our staff members are as historically interested as everybody else. And our Karen has discovered a company that does historic walking tours, and they do them in Tacoma and Steilacoom and Olympia. And it's like, why not Lakewood? Because we have a lot of really interesting things to do, and you can walk along our historic streets. So we want to amend our proposed work plan to include communicating with this company. They're called Pretty Gritty Tours. And I think that's for Tacoma, which is usually called Grit City for some of us who are either native Tacomans or the children of native Tacomans, which is me.
Do we have ghosts? Because that sells.
Well, I'm pretty sure we could come up with some.
History, ghost, walking tour, they go together.
Yes.
I don't know
Well,
how many places
and-
I've been,
and,
I've seen people line up for those.
Yeah, I think Marjorie has ghosts, and one of my ideas for a Lakewood walking tour would be a tour of Marjorie's house. So that would be good. So then there's a lot of different things that we could look at. And what this company does is they actually do the research and they develop scripts, but then they make those available for the city. And the city can choose to go ahead and fund that, and then they do the tours for free. People can just sign up to join the tour and they don't have to pay. The other thing that they do is they can also develop tours that are paid tours. So they ask people for whatever sum of money that they need for that, and they do the tour for them. And they have a variety. They don't just do historic things. They have some other ones, like they have a sweets tour that Karen really, really wants to go on. And I looked at their website, and it's absolutely excellent. And one of the other ones that they have is a brewery tour. So, because Tacoma has a pretty good brewery district, and that kind of got my wheels turning, because Lakewood has the RAM. And the RAM is a Lakewood institution. It started in 1971. They are 2 years shy of historic viability. So it's very nice. And while they are no longer in their original place, they're still doing what they always did. And I'm in there once or twice a month at least, and their walls are covered with historic pictures of Lakewood, and they're very proud to be here and be from where they're from. So I wonder if people would like to do a little walking tour through the Oak Park neighborhood with a stop for a refreshing taster curl at the RAM. Yeah, I mean, I would pay for it, and I'm sure we can find some ghosts somewhere in Lakewood. I know we've got them. So we'll see all of that. So, but we have other places too. We have our Colonial Center that has the museum is at the old theater, and there's a lot of walkable areas in Lakewood that are historic, even as modern as mid-century stuff. You can't miss the House of Donuts. This is always good. Fort Steilacoom Park in and of itself is a good walk, with the old hospital, and you can go across the street and see the old fort. And you can also go through the museum at Western State, and I know there's ghosts there. That should be an easy sell, that one. So lots of different things. So I got to look through my little notes here. But anyways, I want to, and we haven't had a chance to discuss it as a group yet, but I have a feeling we could get everybody on board to see if we can get pretty gritty tours to come to one of our meetings and talk about, you know, what the possibilities are for Lakewood and see what we can come up with. We've got $3,500 in this year's budget, and so I'm sure that maybe we could allocate a portion of that to developing some scripts and all of that kind of thing. So, and I passed out for everybody our copy of our really good driving tour. And I think walking tour is kind of a nice segue from that, because it would include some places where you can actually get in there and see stuff. That's a little bit difficult sometimes with some of the 38 places that we have on our list there. But there are quite a number of them that you can actually go in, which is very nice. Always Lake Walled Gardens. And we're open to any ideas, so anybody who lives in a sort of historic neighborhood, if you have any plans or ideas for walking tours, garden tours, anything, we're always open for public input.
Always open for
Yeah.
suggestions.
All right, so that's it for me, unless anyone has questions.
Questions?
Point there, if I may.
Mr. Whalen?
You pinged on something that Tacoma has done pretty well over the years, which is the historic walking tour or garden tours. And that might be something interesting that the Historical Society could put on with the cooperation of certain homeowners. And it doesn't have to be necessarily contiguous. I know in Tacoma they've had the map and you drive from one to the other if they're not, you know, easy to walk to. And that's been a pretty popular thing to do, and that might be a neat way to get the Historical Society on the map, so to speak, with the rest of the community if it was a well-publicized, interesting summer type event. So I thought the history piece in the write-up that was done by the consultant for the designation of the neighborhood was fascinating for me, and I enjoyed reading that, so thanks for putting it together.
Yeah, I really enjoyed having the Northwest Vernacular people here. They were just absolutely excellent, and they, I think, kind of fell in love with Lakewood a little bit, which was really nice. So that's kind of how I feel about it. So my mom was a self-described South Tacoma girl who never aspired to the riches of Lakewood, but she managed to pick the right guy. And so she ended up in Lakewood, and she was always very, very pleased with that. And she would have been just, you know, hunting these people down to tell them what kind of walking tours they needed to do of Lakewood. So I have to do that work now, but I'm here, I'm ready. So.
Any other questions? Well, thank you for, thank you for all you do, and keep up the good work. And just like last year, your pay's doubled. Next up is our legacy plan update with Ms. Kelly Fong and Ms. Dodsworth.
Well, good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, and council members. I'm joined here with Mary Dodsworth, and we're here tonight to talk about our legacy plan update. Tonight's presentation is really to focus on the survey data that we did for the legacy plan. We'll talk briefly about the other engagement events, but we will be coming back to council in December to discuss more on the other engagement events, as well as steps forward and future recommendations, et cetera. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is really just to go over that survey data and be informative in that way. So just as a quick review from our last meeting, why the update now? So the update to the legacy plan is, number one, to remain timely, and number two, to make sure that Lakewood's finger is on the proverbial pulse, that we are being reflective and responsive to the needs of the community, and then finally, to remain competitive for grant funding. Table A in your memo, as well as up here on the presentation, shows the legacy plan update phases. And as you can see right now, we're currently in phase 1 and phase 2, which are the environmental scan and the needs assessment. And really, we're collecting a lot of data to see, what's going on in Lakewood and what kind of feedback we receive from residents and various stakeholders. If you look through the rest of 2019 and 2020, we have phase 3, which is plan development coming up, and then the approval phase starting in the spring of 2020. Some areas that we're looking to update include the community profile, our goals and objectives, our inventory, and then also doing a needs assessment and looking at our level of service. So engagement events, we've done quite a few. We've actually been in contact with about 832 individuals. We've had 3 open houses and 9 engagement events and 2 surveys. And as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we'll be coming back in December to talk a little bit more about what we've heard in the engagement events, and we're going to focus today just on the survey primarily. But here is a table listing all of the events that we have been to, and we still do have a few more that are forthcoming. So we do have the Youth Council on October 7th. And in addition to the Youth Council, we're looking to schedule 2 more kind of out in the community events and looking to do that in District 3 specifically to get more feedback from residents that may be in that area. When we were starting this process and thinking about engagement and outreach, we were going to do a survey. And one of the things that we knew with the survey is that historically here in Lakewood, as well as just surveys in general, there tend to be groups that are overrepresented and groups that are underrepresented. So knowing that, we intentionally tried to be strategic about where we held our engagement events. And so we have had events throughout Lakewood at existing community events. So we have been, as you can see on Table B here, we've been out to the Ready to Learn Fair. We've been to National Night Out in Springbrook. We went to the Tillicum Community Center for another Ready to Learn Fair. So we've been going throughout the community to try to get feedback from residents and stakeholders who might not traditionally give feedback via surveys. So looking at our surveys, just as a reminder, we did have 2 of them. We had a controlled survey that went to a randomly selected 2,000 residents here in Lakewood. And then we had our open survey, which was available to anyone and everyone. And we put a big plug on it on our social media and our website, as well as our city manager updates. The surveys were all available in English and Spanish and Hangul. Of the controlled survey, like I said, we sent out 2,000. We had about 1,850 or so that actually reached the residents. And out of those, we had 168 completed surveys, which was a response rate of 9%, which is not incredibly high. However, it is higher than the last survey we did for the initial legacy plan. So we're gonna take a look here at our controlled survey. Take a look at the demographics and districts, and we'll start here with districts. If you look on the left-hand side, we do have a picture of the districts here in Lakewood, and it's hard to see up here, but you also have this in your memo. But the red dots represent those who did not take the survey, but were selected for the survey, and the blue dots represent those who did complete the survey. On the right-hand side, you can see kind of the breakdown by districts. And one thing to point out is that District 5 is heavily represented, and this is something that we have seen historically in surveys throughout Lakewood. And you can see that District 3 and District 2 are underrepresented, and again, this is a theme that Lakewood has seen.
Yes, I'll definitely agree with that.
Looking at the controlled survey by housing type, the left-hand side shows you what the housing stock here in Lakewood is as a whole. And then the right-hand side, graph 2.2, shows you who took the survey. So again, you see an overrepresentation of people who live in single-family residences and a underrepresentation of people who live in apartments. When we look at survey, again, this is just the controlled survey by income. Lower incomes were underrepresented and higher incomes were overrepresented. On this one, it shows you the demographics, and you can see that white Caucasian is overrepresented and Hispanic is underrepresented. One thing to take a note is that the controlled survey was slightly more representative than the open survey. And Table E in your memorandum kind of breaks down, you can see a little bit more detail of how many participants we had actually taking the survey, in addition to the open and controlled survey. Looking at age, so the open survey in this case was more representative than the controlled survey, so we had a lot of older people taking the controlled survey. One age group to kind of point out here, just to kind of really illustrate that, is the 25 to 44-year-olds. When you look at the controlled survey, you had about 18% of survey participants take that in that age group, where Lakewood's made up of around 36%. But in the open survey, that was actually 41%. So we have a younger age actually taking the open survey than the controlled survey. So now getting to the actual questions of the survey. The survey did ask, well, I guess this is one more demographic question. So the survey also asked you to describe your family household, and there isn't any census data. The rest of those graphs showed you kind of comparative to 2010 as well as 2017 estimates, just to give you a comparison. This one doesn't, but it does give you kind of an idea of the family types that were taking the survey. There was the option to also select other, and then to describe how you would describe your family situation, and what we saw a lot of was grandparents. So now getting to the actual questions of the survey. So the first question asked how close people lived to the nearest park. And a lot of people overwhelmingly said that they lived within the 5 to 10 minute range or under. So this is 3 to 5 blocks or less. So you can see about 82% in the open survey and 80% in the controlled survey. The next question asked how often you went to a park. And again, a lot of people indicated that they are using the park. So this is how often you went in the last year. Very few in the gray on the right-hand side are those who indicated that they did not go to parks. Again, a little bit higher in the controlled survey than in the open survey. So more people who are taking the open survey indicated that they were going to parks at a more frequent rate. The third question asked people to identify how they got to parks when they went to them, and overwhelmingly, people drove to get to parks, and that was pretty similar across the boards on not only the open and controlled, but also when you broke it down by demographics, which the memorandum does provide a little bit more detail into demographic groupings. Question 5 asked how important park features were to people. And so in this question, people could select a not important, a neutral, and then an important, and they were weighted. So not important was a 1, neutral was a 2, and then important was a 3. And then this was given the score based on the average of what people were grading these particular items. And as you can see, between the open and the controlled survey, there's not a whole lot of difference between what people identified as the most important features. You can see restrooms, natural areas, trails, and parking spaces as some of the highest ranking. And likewise, there's not a whole lot of difference on some of the lower ranking features, which were tennis courts, baseball and softball fields, outdoor basketball courts, and lifeguard stations. So tended to be your more organized sports where you'd have a lot more youth generally playing or younger people taking advantage of these particular events. It's kind of those elements that if you use them, and if you don't, you're not likely to ever use them.
I had a question on that, if I may. I mean, I was a little bit surprised to see the weighting of the soccer or the baseball and the softball fields, and I presume soccer fields, although the word soccer isn't up there, that I can see, playgrounds. Oh, there it is there in the middle of the chart there. I was surprised to see the softball fields as low as they were because we've spent a lot of money on them and we're looking to spend $1 million on lighting and artificial turf coming in. Does it make you question the investment?
It doesn't, because we've seen a real trend nationally as well as locally with youth baseball, at least through our local youth baseball organizations like Lakewood Baseball Club, dropping. But where we see that investment paying off, we have the opportunity for local folks to use it, but it brings in tournaments. Tournaments are typically 2 to 3 days. With the turf field, we see that increasing, and that is more of an economic impact for the community. So it's utilizing Fort Silicon Park as the economic engine that it can be, bringing folks in, they're gonna spend the night, go to our stores, our grocery stores, our gas stations, et cetera. So where you might be making those kinds of, you might not really want to see those kinds of investments in your neighborhood parks, but in a place like Fort Silicon where you have the capacity to deal with larger groups and for long periods of time, I think that investment is good. But it does help us set some priorities when we're doing master planning for neighborhood parks versus community regional parks, and kind of the infrastructure you would put in to those facilities.
Would it ever be appropriate or helpful in the controlled survey to target not just residents, but users of the park, which might not be residents captured in the survey? Because you might get a different skewing of the data by people who actually use the park more.
It kind of takes away from your controlled setting too, because if you talk to people that go to the dog park, they're going to talk to you about all the great things they want you to see at the dog park and maybe not really give you feedback on anything else. I know when we went to some of the neighborhood areas, it was very hot and they were very interested in spray parks. But we, so, and then,
Right.
it's not soccer season. And it was kind of before our lifeguards came on duty. So sometimes the time of year that you do things also can create the response. If it's wet and cold, they might be looking for more indoor activities. If it's bright and sunny, they may be looking for more outdoor activities. So if you focus on specific users, you should be asking maybe not general questions, but really specific to that experience, what's going to make it better, easier, more accessible kind of a thing.
Okay.
And one thing I noticed from your heat map is that there seems to be some correlation between the responses to the survey and proximity to parks. So if you just look across Oak Brook, for example, and you look from east to west, the closer you get down to Fort Silicon Park, the more responses that you have, and that's, there are some areas where they're kind of lack of response or that are the areas that are farthest from the parks. So I can see where you get the survey, and part of the decision process of whether you send it in or not is, are you a user?
So moving to question 6. Question 6 asked reasons why you or a member of your household went to parks. Again, when you look at the controlled and the open survey, the reasons people identified that they went to the parks was very consistent across both surveys, with enjoying the outdoors or nature, running or walking, or to attend special events. And again, the lowest reasons were also very consistent. So, and these were, again, things that people would tend to use or not use, like the community garden, for example, was the top rated in both surveys. Question 7 asked you to rate the parks. Again, you're given a 1 to 3, 1 being poor, 2 being fair, and 3 being excellent. And there was also a button to indicate that you had not been to that park, so you didn't have to score it, and so those were not taken into consideration when finding these averages. And what you can see is Fort Steilacoom Park scored very high. And then you have parks like Wards Lake and Edgewater Park, which scored very low. And I think the important thing to keep in mind right now with those parks is that they are going through a master park planning process. The next question asked what the main park you visited. Overwhelmingly, the main park that was visited was Fort Steilacoom Park, and that is our regional park. Following our regional park, it's our community parks that were identified as the next most frequent main park that people visited, with American Lake and Harry Todd. And then after that, you kind of see all of the neighborhood parks. Interestingly, there is a geographic correlation to which parks you do visit, although overwhelmingly people identified Fort Steilacoom Park. When you actually do break it down by district and take a look at this data, you can see that in District 3 and District 2, for example, while people were still going to Fort Steilacoom Park, they also identified their neighborhood parks as the most frequent they went to. So for example, we have Wards Lake Park and Springbrook Park here identified. Moving on to question 9, asked you how you would rate the following park elements. So what rated high were elements that the city has put a lot of resources in the past couple of years. So for example, baseball fields and softball fields ranked very high, as well as playgrounds, dog parks. Things that ranked really low were tennis courts and basketball courts, which we've also seen rank low on the priority features, important features. So baseball and softball field is one of those that kind of bucks that trend of it being identified as a low importance feature, but ranked really high as far as the overall quality. Question 10, what were your reasons for not visiting a park? The majority of people, or at least a large minority of the people, identified that none of these things that were listed prevented them from actually using city parks and that they go frequently. What was identified was no time and feelings of safety. Those were kind of the 2 big ones that were identified. And a thing to keep in mind is with the no time, the city really has minimal to no control over that. Whereas with some of the other things of like feelings of safety or not knowing where they are, communication, the city has a little bit more control over. On the bottom ranked reasons, it's important to point out that fees were not identified as something that prevented people from going to the parks. I know this has been kind of a big push with the last legacy plan. In addition, customer service was not a reason that people identified that they didn't go to parks. We did have, on this particular question, it said safety concerns, please provide a reason, or if there was another reason that wasn't listed, provide that. And so you see here a lot of the people that did select that button. You could select as many of those options as you wanted, selected security, and when you looked at the reason that they listed on that, they typically identified perceptions of safety or having heard of crimes or seen suspicious characters. Very few were actually like they were witnessing crimes. It was more of they had heard, seen, or thought that they could exist in those areas. Other things that were identified were access issues and dog park users. There were a lot of comments about people being unhappy with off-leash dogs.
And not in the dog park, but off-leash in the parks in other areas, is what they were referring to.
Yep.
And waste, dog waste.
Yeah, a lot of dog waste. And you can see all of the comments actually in Appendix A, provides it on a breakdown. Question number 11 said, can you identify what you think should be the top 3 priorities for the city, given that the city has limited resources? And you can see, again, fairly consistent on what people identified as the top priorities for the city, which were natural areas, restrooms, trails, playgrounds, and as Mary mentioned, spray parks. We heard a lot of spray parks as we went throughout this process. The question also asked people if one of your priorities wasn't listed, what would it be? And so we heard a lot of, increasing security measures. And then, as you can see from this graph, a lot of the other ones were kind of one-offs, where it was like singular, such as pickleball came up once. And then a lot of the things that people did make comments on could have fit into categories that were identified, such as, trails and walking, for example. Question 12 kind of switched to the recreational side, and it asked people how often they went to special events or recreation programs. And what you can see here is that most people, so in the open survey 84% and in the closed survey 75%, went to at least one recreation program or special event here in the city of Lakewood. When it's 2 or more, that goes to 63% and 52%. People in the open survey identified that they went to these events at a more frequent rate than those in the controlled survey. This question asked you to rate your satisfaction with our recreation programs and special events. And they were again looking at kind of elements that would make up those programs. And I think the important thing on this slide is when you look at it, none of these elements ranked below a 2. They're all 2.2 and above for recreation and special events. Question 14 asked if you didn't go, what were your reasons? Very similar to the parks question, and again, very similar to that question. You see that most people identified that they were going to special events or that nothing prevented them from going. When they did identify things that were, it was again too busy or no time or not aware of the programs. So some communication, but then again, some things that the city has very limited control over. Things that were ranked pretty low for why they weren't going was poor quality program, too far away. So those came up pretty infrequently. This question also let people identify other reasons that might not have been on that list. And in that particular case, we see a lot more people identifying access issues and programming needs. So a lot of things that we saw were they just don't have programs that we're interested in going to. So that is a kind of quick review of some of the information that we saw in these surveys. Just as far as next steps go, we are tentatively coming back before the City Council, like I mentioned earlier, on December 9th, and we'll be reviewing engagement events and open house data, as well as some other elements of this as we move forward. We'll be back heavily in the kind of winter, spring of 2020 to discuss the legacy plan updates. And we're going to continue to have meetings once a month with our legacy plan task force, as well as frequent visits with the Parks and Recreation Advisory Board. So that concludes our presentation, and if you have any questions or comments.
Questions? Ms. Moss?
Thank you. Did you get any responses about this one that's saying none of the activities that they were interested in? Did you get anything of interest that we don't provide?
We have received some programming interest that people have identified, and we'll have a little bit more on that at our next meeting. We'll review that.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Whalen?
Well, I think it's helpful to have the data. It'd be great to have more of it, more responses, from both the controlled and the open group, but it is what it is. 3 comments, because I know we're just in the midst of this process. That came through the spray park, or thing came up to me somewhat loudly through many of the comments, and I would hope we can plant a seed to eventually do one at the right location. I think, from my humble opinion, if we ever get the urban park going here in the town center, that would be a great opportunity for that, because it would provide that stickiness for the shoppers and families to come. Just something to think about. There were comments in there that I thought were consistent with what I have heard, which is, gee, it would be great to have more communication. And as much as we flagellate ourselves about, we do so much communicating, people always, I don't want to say complain, but comment about more is better. And so there was an actual comment there about a reader board. It wasn't my comment, just putting it out there, but I think there is a desire to have more and better communication other than just print like Suburban Times or having people having to go to the website to retrieve something off the city's website. So I think that's an appropriate comment as we go forward. And then finally, there was a page of farmers market comments that I found instructive because it's anecdotal stuff that I hear all the time from people who say, gee, I wish we could have it later in the day or on a date where people from the community could actually enjoy it as opposed to people just in the downtown core. And I know that you guys get a lot of positive comments from the people who come on Tuesday, but it is something to think about as we open the Colonial Center location, perhaps a location change to the Colonial Center. And, you know, I personally would love to see something that would provide an opportunity for more people in the community to come later in the day to attend it. I know we tried it a couple years ago, maybe in a different location with other stuff. We try it again. But it's something to think about as you're going through the legacy plan. Those are my 3 takeaways.
Any other questions, comments? Ms. Park?
2 suggestions for your engagement events, Lakewood United. They're all bundled right there and nobody's afraid to talk. And then also the North Lakewood Neighborhood Association, that's very well attended. So I think you would get some good input there.
Is that the young guy, Dan? What's his name? Yeah, Patrick, excuse me. Sharp kid.
Thank you for the information.
Ms. Dodsworth, you've been remarkably quiet
I
tonight.
know, isn't that amazing? I did want to share just a couple of things that have just happened recently regarding community engagement and kind of where we're going. We haven't really touched base, you know, on the CIP, the future CIP. We've been giving you a lot of information on our 6-year CIP, but as you recall with the legacy plan, we had 250-ish projects and how we prioritize them. And so that we'll be looking at, you know, what are the next 250 things we might think about doing. We've done an awful lot, of course, but so that'll be coming up. And in that vein, 2 things that we're kind of working on. One is that we had a really interesting meeting with Pierce College with the turf infields and the potential for lights and the development in that. They are really looking for a home field. You know, they started there, they used to play there, and so they're really interested in maybe working with us and having one of our fields at Fort Steilacoom be their home field, where when they're not using it, we would have access to it for our tournaments. Again, that would be, you know, championship game of the tournament would be another way of building that. And so, of course, they'd be bringing the resources in to help expand that. So we're having those conversations now. So just want to make sure you're in the loop on that. And of course, more would come when we got something. But they have resources they've been building up, and they've been at Mount Tahoma High School, not super happy there. You know, they've had a lot of work in Puyallup, but they'd really like to come home, you know, to that field. So we're talking about that. The second meeting we had today was with representatives from the Nisqually tribe, and they're really interested. We've met with them. You as a council have been working on your relationship with their tribal council. And we had a great meeting today with them talking about, in conjunction with our Angle Lane project, how in our Discovery Trail program out there, how they might share interpretive information, cultural information, art. And so we had a really great meeting today talking about where it could be located, how it could be expanded through the park, different elements that might be integrated, and what the time frame is for what we're doing, and how they could contribute and participate. So that was a really great conversation too. So, you know, we have long-term plans and goals, where we have short-term plans and goals and things that are kind of continuing throughout. So, so I just wanted to share that as well. And that we do have the Pretty Gritty Tour at Fort Steilacoom Park late October happening this year. So that's,
Nice.
Their group has already met a goal on their plan in that way. It's a fee-based tour at this time, and they're doing it to look at how they can introduce their services in Lakewood, and we're starting at the park. Not too many ghosts,
Was that
because
house?
we're pretty respectful of the different activities that have occurred there, and the fake news that, you know, they've had in that park regarding some of the things that were occurring. And so they're really a great company. They're very respectful of the site and the history, and wanting to tell those stories that are interesting and interactive. And so that'll be happening towards the late end of the month. before
What is
Halloween
that?
time.
Do they actually post people out there, kind of like a, I don't want to say a haunted house, but
No, they
kind
do
of
more of
interpretive
a, they do more of a meet 20 or 30 folks, and they have, it's people that present and they kind of have theater background. So they're not, it's not so much at this point where you'd have someone on the different corners. They would take the group and go through, like, by the barns, around the lake.
Oh,
We've
and
talked,
explain
it'll
history.
be like a candlelit lantern
Well, fun.
flashlight tour.
Yeah.
And so there, we have that, it'll be in the connection, so we'll get that word out in time for folks to sign up and be a part of that.
Kind of fun.
Anything else? Thanks again. We now move to the downtown sub-area transportation mitigation fees update with Mr. Buer.
Mr. Tax.
What?
Mr. Tax.
No fees free.
Give me just a minute, please. Okay, I'm ready now. This presentation is to give the council an update on the downtown sub-area plan trip mitigation fee program. The topics I'm going to try to cover are the background, the establishment of the traffic mitigation fee, how the fee is calculated, some of the program rules, and the mitigation assessments to date. The other thing that I would mention is that in accordance with the current ordinance, this is reviewed by the City Council on a biennial basis. So when you go through your next budget process in accordance with that ordinance, you would have an opportunity to comment once again on this project. There are a couple of erratas that I'd like to bring to your attention. The first one is on the top of page 161, where it talks about conversion of Bristol Avenue into a public street. That's not correct. That was a part of your TIP program. I just want to make mention of it. And on page 165, the total mitigation fee is listed at $184,209.68. The actual number is $174,495.01, and the result of that error is because we use a great big massive Excel spreadsheet to make the determination, and I think the person writing the report made an error. But I went through and checked the numbers. The actual number is $174,495.01. Under background, if you don't mind, I'm going to geek out for just a minute and explain the difference between an impact fee versus a SEPA mitigation fee, because there's some confusion of that because they're not the same, and they are. The impact fee is a one-time charge assessed by a local government against new development project to help pay for new and expanded public facilities that will directly address the increase in demand for services created by that development. And the law says specifically that the impact fees are to be used for public streets and roads, publicly owned parks, open space, recreation facilities, school facilities, and fire protection facilities. The impact fee gets its implementing regulation through the Growth Management Act. Usually the impact fee is set citywide, and that the impact fees are to be expended or encumbered within 6 years of receipt, which is usually with the building permit having been issued. That's an impact fee. SEPA mitigation fee, I'm going to read this, you'll see some correlation, but also a difference, is a one-time charge assessed by a local government against a new development project to pay for, quote, the mitigation of impacts on public facilities and services. So in many ways, it's broader than an impact fee. And with the specific sub-area plan, this was addressed through traffic, where we call it the traffic mitigation fee. It is not an impact fee per se. A mitigation fee is set by SEPA, not by GMA. And so the state actually provides different ways of collecting fees. In this case, the SEPA traffic mitigation fee was set by Ordinance 696, which was your planned action ordinance. There's a big difference in that a traffic mitigation fee is very specific area. In this case, it was the downtown sub-area plan, whereas an impact fee would be citywide. In my opinion, as a part of a planned action ordinance, the level of improvements that are identified are more specific, a little bit more granular, and that's because you have to go through an EIS process where you normally do not have to do that with an impact fee ordinance. And then another big difference is that the SEPA mitigation fees are to be expended or encumbered within 10 years of receipt, not 6. So you get a little bit of a break.
Can I ask you to go back on the definition of SEPA? The
Okay.
SEPA mitigation fee, say it again.
A one-time charge
Right.
assessed by a local government against new development project,
New development projects.
right, to pay for the mitigation of impacts on public facilities and services. We'll get into this a little bit further in the discussion.
Okay.
Because in Lakewood, the issue comes down to redevelopment, particularly
Right.
in the downtown area.
Right.
Okay? An important aspect of all this is there's no double dipping. You can't collect both an impact fee and a SEPA mitigation fee.
Okay.
And in this particular case, the implementing ordinances were 695 and 696. They were adopted on October 1st, and they became effective on November 1st. I only mention this is because they've not been in operation that long. The establishment of the traffic mitigation fee, and this is sort of a history on this in case people are not familiar with it. The plan action ordinance identified 8 capital projects for the downtown totaling $28.9 million. That same ordinance also adopted the PM peak hour trips for the entire downtown area at 6,658. Now, at the time of the adoption of the planned action ordinance and the downtown plan, there was a big discussion, who pays for the $28 million? At one time, the original suggestion was 80% would be paid by the development community. Council said not so fast, and you split it 50-50. So the city's share is I'm going to round up, 14.5 million. The developer's share is also 14.5 million. So basically what we do is we take the 14.5 million, divide by 6,658 total trips, which gets you your traffic mitigation fee of $2,173.62. So if you increase the traffic mitigation fee either through new development or as a result of a tenant improvement or change of use that generates additional traffic mitigation or traffic, then you pay a fee minus any credits to the prior use. So we're really big on trying to identify prior use because people do get breaks. Now, how the traffic mitigation fee is calculated, the real simple explanation is in one sentence, but more of this is found on pages 164 and 165. You take the peak hour rate from the traffic engineer's trip generation manual for a specific use based on size, multiply it by the traffic mitigation fee minus any prior use peak hours on that site, and that's how we go through that process. As we've used this, we've also developed some program rules, and some of this is outlined in your ordinance, some of this is administrative. Number 1, applicants submit a mitigation fee request form, so we are able to track exactly what it is they have versus what it is they're proposing. And then the Community Development Department, along with the Public Works Department, review that, and then we estimate the traffic mitigation fee. Number 2, nonprofit temporary uses are exempt from the traffic mitigation fees. Number 3, transportation mitigation fees run with the land and not with the tenant improvement per se. So if you have one large parcel and you're putting in a new restaurant on one of the suites, that whole parcel gets assigned that amount or that traffic mitigation amount rather than the specific suite.
Do you not divide it up based upon the
We
square
let
footage?
we let the property owner divide it up.
Okay. But that would be based on new construction.
Minus any existing credits. And then you get into the question of, is the tenant, if there's a tenant improvement, does that tenant improvement increase the number of traffic onto the site?
Raises a bunch of questions.
Okay.
So if you've got, let's just say the Colonial Center, old site existing.
Mhm.
You know, at one point had a pre-existing use,
Mm-hmm.
dilapidated, old, you know, somewhat vacant. So you bring someone new into one of those suites, does that necessarily increase what was historically there? Hard to say, right?
Hard to say.
Yeah.
So we have to go through a process where we identify the uses, determine the existing, or what we believe is the traffic count for the area. We take into account the historic uses. We take a look at the total, and then what is being proposed. And do you end up having to pay more or paying for the traffic mitigation fee, or not at all? And in this particular case, you have two restaurants, one of which is currently in operation, one of which is not. We would probably grant both. Another one that comes up to mind is the Old Joe's.
Right.
The Old Joe's gets, under our rules, gets a credit for the previous retail use. A QFC site also would get a credit for the,
So, interesting. So let's think about this for a minute. So QFC site blown down. Let's just say it's completely scraped and there's a new configuration on it. You're still gonna take the pre-existing, hugely trafficked at one point, grocery store as part of the traffic count for the new development that might be mixed use or office.
okay.
I'm just asking the question
Okay.
because it comes up, believe me. Yeah.
And to answer that question, what I did do is go back and take a look at what other impact fee ordinances do when they look at credits and exemptions. It's quite common that if you're tearing down a building, you get to keep the credits that go with the previous building. And so basically what we're doing is taking established policy that other people have used and applying it to our mitigation fee.
Do you have a historic look-back limit? So in other words, if you got this decrepit QFC that's been vacant for 13 years, but our look-back's only pick a number 5 or 10, administratively, how are you exercising your discretion?
That's something that I would work out between the Public Works Director and myself. A good case in point on that is, I'm changing subject slightly, is Barbecue Pete's. Because that site has been vacant as far as I can recall.
Which one is it? I see the thing, but I don't know where they're coming in.
They're, it's next to Crunch
Oh, by
Fitness
SARS.
on the very end. So that has been problematic. We've asked for the developer to tell us what's there, give us a historic perspective, and we would be able to grant something. Another one, this is an attempt by the city to be
Right, I get it.
fair, is 9600 Bridgeport Way. This is an office complex that became vacant, that then was sold, that then went into bankruptcy and foreclosure, that then went into a divorce proceeding. And so the question is they're coming in with improvements now. What do they get? And we've come to the conclusion that it was a previously in office use, so we would grant them the current credits on that. What's the little kicker that's a little different there is we get into some issues over fire sprinklers. So that's a different or separate issue, but we were able to work out the traffic mitigation. So when we go through this process, this involves several different staff members before we're able to make the calculation.
It's a little more art than science. Like law.
So do you go back to the old racetrack on,
Yeah.
or the Lakewood, the ice arena? I mean,
Well,
highly trafficked.
either, none of those are in the downtown plan area.
I'm sure something was there. Mr. Branstetter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Respectfully, Mr. Buer, I'm not sure that I think that what you're telling me makes sense. When we were working on the downtown area plan and we were discussing traffic mitigation needs, we started with an existing traffic count of what the traffic was, and that was based on what the traffic was based on the uses that were there at the time that the consultant came in and did the study and told us that that was the count. And then they said, and if what you want to happen happens, the account will go up by this 6,000 or 7,000, so that the historical date about what any parcel was generating traffic would be the date or the approximate date that we adopted the plan, because our calculation of how many additional trips there would be was based on the existing trips, not historical trips going back a previous decade. And, you know, when we adopted the SEPA ordinance and the plan, I guess we didn't particularly specify a historical look-back date. But would that be both doable and appropriate for us to do that, to ease calculations? Because the existing trips for a QFC site, per se, just didn't exist when we adopted the target of 6,000 additional trips that we're using to calculate the fee. You know, so I think that looking at and clarifying that calculation is something that would be an option the council should look at to be able to go back and do that. We already took a look at saying we didn't want to saddle developers with a significant majority of these costs by pulling back to the 50-50 formula from the 80-20 formula. But I think that we did have a baseline of trips, and that to be able to historically say the historical baseline is now greater, the historical number of trips is greater than the baseline, is not consistent with what we did.
Mr. Whalen?
I think that's true, but I think, and this is where I may have missed it, but when we were doing some of the policy analysis, my thought was that filling vacant spaces was going to be an exercise different than the application of the calculation for new development, which would increase the trips beyond the 6,000 or whatever. But what I do hear Mr. Buer saying, in exercising some discretion, that in effect they are giving some benefit to redevelopment of existing buildings by giving credit for historic trips, as opposed to new development, which wouldn't have historic trip usage per se.
I would tell you that this sub-area plan is a little difficult to administer because most sub-area plans is all brand new. Most sub-area areas
Right.
that you're developing is all brand new. And
Right.
here you're working with existing buildings and established uses, and this issue of redevelopment, how to address existing suites, is cumbersome at times. And we've tried to find a way to develop some workarounds, in my opinion, to make this a little bit easier for people to work with, but at the same time, keep your ordinance intact as far as
I
administration.
get it. I just, I'm hesitant, and I get it. I think you're trying to do a good job of being fair, provided there's a logical basis to the application of the rule. But I just don't want to hinder development of getting these empty spaces filled. That's my biggest concern.
So I had a question that I thought was going to be part of this presentation, which is a real simplistic one. If you look at the two big ones here, who granted have traffic, Dutch Brothers and Barbecue Pete's, how is their $60,000 fee compared to where they would have ended up without this program?
Good point.
Right, that's the issue.
The SEPA analysis would have probably required the level of improvement that would be probably equal to or higher. Because you'd be, if you already have the existing capital improvement plan established for the downtown plan.
They don't have to do SEPA.
And they don't have to do SEPA, and they don't have to do the improvements on the street.
True. Yeah,
That's true for Dutch Bros. It's not, there is some relationship with that with Barbecue Pete's, because ultimately you're turning the Lakewood Town Center Boulevard into a public street. Now, if you don't adopt the capital facilities plan that goes with the downtown plan, then it's a different subject.
Mr. Volkey.
So, a couple of points to dovetail onto that, and then the flip side of impact fees, or these type of fees, whatever we're calling this one, traffic mitigation fees, is they don't have to do SEPA. And so when we did the downtown plan, we took that burden off all the developments, correct?
Yes.
Or no? Correct. Okay, so redevelopment knew that was the deal was, we do the downtown plan, the sub-area plan, we do the EIS, you don't have to do the SEPA, but now we're gonna count up, or we're gonna come up with an estimate of your daily trips, and that's how we're gonna establish what you did.
Yes.
So that's always the, you know, I've watched them do this at the county. I mean, that's always the deal with the devil they make on these impact fees, right? Some people don't like them, but that's the reality is that they don't have to do these analysis in some cases of larger developments, and they don't have to spend $umpteen thousand on an EIS. That's what they. Correct?
That's correct. Is that this is, well, here's the other part to this too. The city's basically taking on and subsidizing the improvements to the tune of 50%.
Right. So my question on this, I find it interesting, and I think maybe you just mentioned the possible answer. So the list, and I appreciate who's paid the assessments to date, and then Alta shows up, and they don't pay anything.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll be pretty busy, I'm assuming. It's a pretty well-known store, actually, pretty well-known company. Explain how that worked.
Because they were coming into an existing retail facility, which was, I forgot the name of it, Pier 1, and they were replacing Pier 1 with Alta, retail for retail, like for like, and therefore there was no charge for any mitigation fees based upon the ITE manual.
Okay.
Now, if I can also talk, another one that's really interesting is,
I think the females in my house have already increased the trip mitigation.
Oh, it was a good pickup for us. It really was, yeah.
if you look at Dutch Bros, their number is 57,677.75. The original number was $71,000 based upon the method by which we calculated under our current code. They said that was too high. And we said to them, if you'll go ahead and do a traffic study to show us that the number is different, we would take a look at that. So they prepared a study. They actually looked at other Dutch Pros in similar areas of their market, and with similar traffic movements, similar to Gravity Lake Drive, they came in and they showed that the traffic mitigation measures, our numbers were higher in the IT manual. So they requested a reduction. It was reviewed by community development, by the public works director, and then it was found to be their numbers would work, and then we approved the lesser number. And if people would take advantage of that, I think they would be surprised at what level of fees they could reduce. That's a 27% reduction in their fee. Barbecue Pete's may have a similar aspect, but they haven't applied or haven't used that approach. And we are certainly encouraging them, particularly for these large food service restaurants that generally create more traffic. Those are the ones that are of concern. And if I can, give you some thoughts on this. There are 13 projects to date. We have 2 more that are on the list. And of the 13 projects, 5, or 38%, were not required to pay traffic mitigation fees. And of the remaining 8 projects, 62% would pay the mitigation fee. Now, the average payment for all of those, minus those applications that not pay the mitigation fee, is about $22,000, but that included these big generators. If you take them out, the average fee comes to $7,500 per business. So that's what this is looking at right now when we were talking about smaller businesses and the impact upon traffic mitigation. That number, on an average basis, would be comparatively light if we were talking about off-street improvements on those individual sites. The big ones are Barbecue Pete's at roughly $61,000, Dutch Bros at $58,000, and Rush Bowls, which is in the Monwig Center, at $18,000. And I'd also note that if you look at the column credit against TMF, question mark, a better way of saying that is credit against prior use. So that's the credit that they're getting that's bringing down their mitigation fee. We're still in the process of evaluating trends and patterns. We have examined impact fee ordinances of other communities. We've tried to make sure that we're not inconsistent as far as credits or mitigations. I think we're pretty much the same as they are. I'm not here at this point to call that, bring into question calling for adjustments. That's up to the city council. I don't think we've had that many projects yet. And so if you're asking for my recommendation, I have no problem keeping the council up to date on the fees and what's being collected. But I think we need more time with this to see how this all works out. So with that, I'll kind of turn it back to the council.
Only half facetiously thought that maybe Dutch Bros got credit for the customers that are duplicates of House of Donuts. We increased traffic, but only for about 50 feet. Mr. Branstetter.
$6,600 additional trips to be generated by development. And we had roughly a $29 million bill we needed to pay. And we wanted developers to pay 50% of that. And then we were going to go out in a variety of ways, come up with the other. So when someone gets a credit, they actually had some trips that they generated.
The existing use? Yes.
Well, the current use. Okay, the proposed use is going to generate some trips.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, and I'm asking, I'm not telling you. Okay. The proposed use is asking for some trips, but because it is no more trips, or it's comparing it to the number of trips that a previous use used at some time, that's where you get a credit. So if I were to just look at the first item up here, or look at Baylor Consulting, which is moving into a building that's a general office building, okay, they're going to pay a fee, so that even though they are probably moving into a building where there was a previous office tenant, they're going to do that. But I moved down to then I moved down to Alta, and they're also moving in, but they're moving into something that used to be a department store, but that they're getting a credit against the trips that used to be in that department store on 59th Avenue Southwest, which is somewhere close to the Old Country Buffet, I suppose, I don't know. But that, do they need a credit because they're actually generating trips? And that's why they're getting a credit?
The way the planned action ordinance is written is that existing use had a number of assigned trips already. And it changed to Ulta. We looked at the change in use. Did that change of use increase the total number of trips over what was previously there? And our assessment was it did not. So therefore, they did not have to pay for a traffic mitigation fee.
So the 6,600 trips, that is the basis for our setting the fee. I mean, it's an approximate number. We had a number, so anticipated increase of 6,600 trips. And we applied that against the 29 million to come up with, or the 14.5 million.
You applied it to the 14.5 million, yes.
We applied it to the 14.5 to determine what it was. So we are saying that none of the 6,600 trips, okay, will be due to
That use.
that use.
That's correct.
Okay, so why give them a credit at all? Why not just, I guess I don't understand, they're getting a credit against not owing anything. So what I want to say is that these numbers over in the credit are not credits against the 14.5 million. In other words, we're still on track to raise 14.5 million of things that won't be a credit. Why not just tell people that their bill is zero? Why calculate a credit?
It's a good question, and what happened here is we took a very big Excel spreadsheet and we put too much information on it. And then, as I look at this, putting in the credit information on it is not necessarily helpful because it raises more questions. You're correct. That's just an auditing mechanism that we're using to see what the number looks like. But you are correct, is that it's basically zero. It's a wash.
Okay, I just want to be sure, we're not saying that credit is being put to the city side of the ledger so that the city is going up while the developer 14.5 is going down.
That's correct.
Ms. Moss?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Buell, on the Rush Bowl, was that originally a $50,000 cost to them originally, and that was negotiated? I think this is the one that talked to me about the amount they were having to pay, and it was more than $18,000. So I'm just thinking, is this the one that was negotiated or credited?
Well, Brush Bowls is going over on the Monwig property over off of 100th Street. It's called Lakewood Pavilion. And there was an existing building there, existing suite. We did an estimate on the total cost. And if you add the $18,056.88 plus the $82.82, that's the full amount. Okay. But as a result of actually going back and taking a look at the previous use to how much traffic they generated, that was what it was reduced down from. So it was roughly about $26,000 originally, and now it's down to $18,056. So again, you know, that's how the numbers were calculated. If, maybe I should bring the full spreadsheet the next time for the council to take a look. No, never mind. Okay.
But I'm glad to hear that because he was interested, he wanted to be here, but the price was, for that was up for, so I'm glad to see that that was able to negotiate. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Buer?
I hope I haven't confused you, anybody on the council.
I have one process question. So an applicant for tenant improvement of an existing space doesn't necessarily go through a SEPA analysis, do they?
No,
Right, even if it's a change of use in the existing facility?
that's correct.
Okay.
But what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the permitting process to see what is the change in allowable activity. It's a good question.
Yeah. So I just want to make sure we're all clear that filling these existing spaces with tenant improvements in existing shells, whether it's a change of use or not, does not implicate a SEPA analysis.
And if it was if there was no SEPA, it was just a straight building permit, there would be no requirement for SEPA whatsoever.
Right.
But where we're trying to take advantage of this is through the EIS and through the Capital Facilities Program. And there are people who've come in and done TIs and not been required to pay for traffic mitigation.
Because the analysis has been used the same.
It's flat.
Yeah, got it.
Right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Reports by the city manager, Mr. Caulfield.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members. I'd like to start off with Chief Sorrow, give you guys an update as a follow-up to his presentation on the civil disturbance team. Was it last week or a week before? And so here's an update as a follow-up to some conversations with the other entities.
So after about a year of going back and forth and getting some language together in an ILA and bringing it forward, and this is, you know, meeting with them as recent as, you know, I think 1 or 2 weeks before coming here. I went back and presented that to everybody, and, you know, with the saying it's all been approved. We had a simple sample ADR language, and the chief of Sumner, who's an attorney, said, yeah, that's not a big deal, the ADR language, but I don't think we're going to be able to staff it. And then Fife chimed in as well and said, I think we're in the same boat as Sumner. We're probably not going to be able to staff it. So I am effectively done with that part. I'm not going to be coming back to you with a civil disturbance team agreement. So I'm going to explore other options and partnering maybe with Tacoma or State Patrol or somebody where, you know, we'll manage our own resources for smaller incidents. And I've talked to Lieutenant Allwine, who's the commander of our element and was the commander of the entire team, who said that just based on what we have right now, we can do quite a bit. Nothing, you know, on a large scale, but, you know, in the event there is something larger, we want to have something in our back pocket. And that might be in the form of sort of a mutual aid agreement or just some sort of training partnership with Tacoma or State Patrol.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mayor. That's good news. Now, I just want to explore this. Are you saying that, and I have no problem with the civil response team here for the city, are you saying we would only partner with Tacoma if we needed to, but we would be thinking we can take care of ourselves pretty much most of the time?
Exactly. And the most significant part of partnering with Tacoma is being able to train with them and having just that bigger resource available.
Good. No, I'll reiterate what I said. This is good news because I was not in agreement with the idea that we had to partner with other cities when it was those very same cities that left us hanging on the Thomas case. So, good news.
Any other questions? Thanks, Chief.
Thank you all. Good.
In advance of your council retreat on Saturday, the 28th, just want to kind of give you a snapshot on the legislative side, kind of some of the things that we're looking at on the, first on the state side. One is tax increment financing language, specifically as it relates to the redevelopment of what we call Lakewood Landing, and really working with Association of Washington Cities on that. The other is the Amtrak Station Assessment Report. However, we've been talking with WashDOT Rail on that, and rather than asking for a hard, cold cash amount of $500,000, what they have suggested is perhaps pursuing a legislative ask for a really focusing on kind of multimodal transportation needs within that area, which would include evaluating a station. At that point, the state legislature will task WashDOT Rail with calculating, okay, what will it cost to do that? And then at that point in time, it might be that, the state will either fund it, but if they don't fund it, what typically happens in many instances is the state legislature will be like, okay, we're not going to give you new money, but go figure it out and make it happen anyways. So I just wanted to give you a heads up on that could be an alternative that might rise to the top. But again, it's something that just came about literally in the last few days, late last week, if I recall.
Mr. Whalen.
Just a quick question on that. There was something in the ether that came out from Sound Transit seeking community input as to how we can best spend $900 million in the community, principally south of Tacoma, which would be Lakewood, DuPont. Could this be a possibility to say, exactly, and that's why we're asking for some multimodal money?
So we already have a strong letter of support from Sound Transit regarding this particular ask. Peter Rogoff, the Sound Transit CEO, is all in on that.
I guess my thought process would be, would they be willing to kick in some study money?
Probably not. This is the responsibility of the state of Washington. It's the same question I asked this body earlier this year. Would you be willing to kick in money? And the answer is it's the responsibility of the state of Washington.
I think isn't the Sound Transit money focused on linking to the Sound Transit system?
That's my understanding, Mayor. Yes, sir.
Yeah, bus and or train.
Or a bridge over train tracks.
And then as we look out. And then as we look out, probably not this session because the capital budget has about $70 million available for the short session. I know that's a lot of money to us, but in the big scheme of things across 49 legislative districts, it's not. But what we're looking to do is set the table for the next budget process. And for the 28th district, what our recommendation would be to continue improvements at Fort Steilacoom Park. Next phase there, ball field lights. And then in subsequent requests, we are in the process of preparing a statement or a one-pager regarding future improvements in support of the H-Barns in partnership with Partner for Parks. And then for the 29th district, given that we're moving forward on a master site plan for Wards Lake, looking to ask for money to implement the Wards Lake master site plan once that's adopted, hopefully sometime next year. But again, as we look out into 21 and 22. On the federal side, really two columns here. One is defense, which would be the Defense Community Improvement Program and getting that funded, as well as issues related to BRAC and, of course, the North Clear Zone. And then the second column would be transportation. And a key example there that we've been advocates for is the former Tiger program, now called BUILD, having a set aside for smaller or medium-sized cities such as Lakewood. That's actually being driven by a congressman here in Washington State. Say again. Rick Larson, thank you, Congressman Larson. And so we're working with his office on that. But again, more to follow at your retreat. But again, just kind of wanted to give you a courtesy heads up on what we're pulling together there. Tomorrow, you might have seen in the newspaper, there was a fatality, KIA over in Afghanistan. Green Beret Sergeant First Class Dustin Ard is actually from Idaho. He will be returning home tomorrow. He'll be landing at JBLM. Sergeant Mark Geeks put out a call for volunteers to this is something that our police department's done for 15 years now, is to have an honor procession to transport him from JBLM over to Mountain View Funeral Home. So if you see our officers out there, that's what that's about. Also, West Pierce Fire and Rescue is looking to hang their garrison flag over at the funeral home as a cemetery as well, coupled with perhaps over at the overpasses. So again, if you see something happening about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, that's what that will be.
Is First Special Forces Group going to have a local memorial?
I do not know, Mayor. I don't know. So, you probably saw that he left a wife, a daughter, and then his wife is pregnant with their son. So pretty sad. At your next meeting, I'd like to request a contract amendment, increasing our contract with Pierce County from $250,000 to $350,000, and that's to do a number of things that they help us out with, vectoring and things along those lines. And the purpose of that is to help backfill us with some of the traffic signal maintenance services that we need. By the way, it doesn't mean we're going to use the whole 100,000. I'm just asking for the authority over the next year and a half or so as we look through some options there. So that'll be coming forward to you as part of your next regular meeting, which is next week. Probably aware the Westwood Financial finally sold and unloaded their property, formerly known as the former QFC property, and so the new property owner is based out of the Portland, Oregon area, Emmert. They're actually focused more on transportation and industrial uses, but they do have some commercial and retail. So Mr. Buer has been having a number of conversations with him about what we'd like to see there, really not just focusing on putting something down in the middle of where that current building is, but looking at some kind of mixed use, some internal roads, creating some corners, also building to, the town center standards that this body put in place to allow for, increased density and things along those lines. So hopefully more to follow. The good news is that, there's a new investor over there. So that's the good news. I want to congratulate our Public Works Engineering Department. Looks like, knock on wood, it's got to go to the full Sound Transit Board, but we've been able to secure over $1 million in support of the 111th Street Southwest, 112th Street Southwest project east of Bridgeport that connects into the Lakewood Transit Center or the Sounder Station over in the Kendrick neighborhood. So that'll help set the stage for some redevelopment over there, particularly TOD. And I think as Mr. Buer and Ms. Newton have communicated in the past, there is a father-son team that's acquiring property over there to do something. So this is a good project that we'll be able to get done. Probably, I'll be talking with Public Works here this week or next week, but probably looking at designing next year and then constructing in 2021. The Economic Development Board requested, since I sit on the board, a statement from the city of Lakewood. So this is what we put together. It'll get posted on the EDB website here in the near future. And so this is something that they're asking of all their board members apparently. And so again, this is what our team put together. Whether you want to build higher, scale up distribution, or get in on the ground floor of the South Sound's next dynamic live, work, play destination, Lakewood has the opportunities to help you compete. We are known for our business-friendly attitude and bulldoze barriers to make economic development a key priority. So you can look to see that. You'll look for that here in the near future. So I want to thank Bryn Grimley and Becky Newton for their help working me with some wordsmithing. And then Sarah Bonds over at ADB put some final touches on it as well. So it's a good team effort there. Makes us look good. And then lastly, the Colonial Plaza grand opening event is this Saturday from 5 p.m. with remarks and presentations at 6 p.m. Mr. Heck will be there, as well as we know two of our elected officials from the 29th District, Senator Conway and Representative Morgan. We'll have a proclamation for those two folks. And I don't know if it's going to be the mayor or the deputy mayor who's going to be kind of emceeing it. Mayor, you can, deputy mayor. So we will have some information for you. And so it should be a fun event. Again, festivities kick off at 5, but then the program begins at 6. So that's what I got. That's my report. Well, we got beautiful northwest weather. Actually, if you haven't driven through there, the light poles arrived last Thursday, and so over the weekend, the contractor was able to get them up. I'm going to drive through there tonight to see if they were energized. They were working on it today. But certainly the goal is to have them energized and all lit up by this weekend.
Questions for the city manager? If not, we'll go to council comments. Ms. Moss?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Speaking about Colonial Center, I had the opportunity to be part of the filming on Saturday. It was really a lot of fun, and it was interesting. There was a couple walking that used to live here, but they now live in Federal Way, and they were just browsing through to see some of the places, and they were so impressed with the growth that they see and disappointed in Federal Way. So we told them we would welcome them back at any time. There you go. Yeah. So, and Saturday night, I attended the Air Force Ball. It was at the Tacoma Convention Center. Well attended, a lot of fun. And so they moved it from the Clover Park Technical College place there. I will miss the grand opening of our Colonial Center on Saturday. I leave for, the Air Force Association Conference is next week. So I will be leaving for DC on Friday. I will not be at our meeting on Monday. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, that's it.
Mr. Renstetter?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The only thing is that I did pass out this copy of a letter from Castle and Associates. And the significance of that letter is a couple of times earlier I mentioned that in the negotiations around the contract to build the Public Safety Communications Center by South Sound 911, there was an issue that was raised at the 11th hour about local workforce on that construction project, and that this letter has been deemed to be a satisfactory statement of their intent that that a significant amount of local labor will be used on that project, and sort of puts that issue to rest. That's all that I have, Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Bulkey?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple of items. I attended the Partners for Parks Bingo Night. It was a lot of fun, really, really well done, very well attended. It was basically a sellout. I think they had 250 people or more there. Very nice event. And I think a lot of folks are getting behind this. Of course, you know, we have a ways to go, and I think everyone realizes that, but it was a very, very well done. Tonight I was at, it was my school board night. So they introduced tonight was the night they introduced all the ASB members from the high schools and the youth council folks. So, and in a lot of cases, they were one and the same. So a number of these young adults or young people were already ASB officers as well as on the youth council. So, and a lot of them showed up tonight. So that was very nice. And so I, you know, spoke to the group about the Colonial Center opening, and to dovetail with the city manager's remarks, I said, I didn't know, even though I drove by there tonight on the way here, that the lights were up. I said, well, I don't know, the lights were up, or we're hoping they're up. And then at open public comment, the union rep, because their union hall is right there, said the lights are up, and we're going to be there. So everyone's excited about that. So it's a big event. Hopefully the weather will hang on just a little bit.
Nice lightning rods.
Ms. Barth?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too enjoyed with Councilmember Moss our 6 seconds of fame on Sunday. Well, they said that the clip would probably be about 6 seconds. So anyway, 6 seconds of fame. If you need autographs, Mary and I will be available after the session tonight. I also attended Partners for Parks. I did not get a bingo, and that's it. Yeah. It was a fun event, though.
Mr. Simpson?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, last week was kind of eventful. September 5th, I believe, I opened up my Wall Street Journal, and there I saw Lakewood, Washington. courtesy of John Simpson, letter to the editor about history. This is September 5th, and it was not, my friend, revised. Wise guy was giving me a hard time before class, or before council. So then Saturday I was reading, of course, the journal, and I came across an article that reminded me of something you said. Last Monday at that podium, you provided proclamations to Chief Zarro and Chief Sharp. And I just happened to read this review of 2 books on 9/11. And one of the things I learned, which I hope we'll have on Wednesday, is that the day before 9/11, there had been a meteorological phenomenon over New York City that left the sky what they called severe clear. Clear. That rarely do they have the kind of sky that we saw on television on that 9/11 day. And then, coming to your point, Mr. Mayor, this one author said, and almost, I don't know, I mean, this was written after you said it, so you didn't plagiarize it. After all, as he notes, the fall of 2019, quote, will mark the entrance of the first college class born after the attacks. This is a new generation that barely remembers the day itself. And it goes back to your point about why Wednesday is so important, that we do not forget what happened on that day. Because as they say here in the pull quote, two vivid and immediate books designed to delay the descent of 9/11 into the well of history, which is what my letter was about on the 5th, about how history has been weaponized and how it can be forgotten if there's a concerted effort to make it forgotten. And then as you read this article, there was just some things that just, this one guy in his writing, that just makes you stop and think. For example, Mohammed Atta was running late at Portland International Jetport in Maine for his flight to Boston, where he would board American Airlines Flight 11, the plane he crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Mike Toohey, a ticket agent in Portland, recalls saying, with the usual professional courtesy, Mr. Atta, if you don't go now, you will miss your plane. And then in parentheses, yes, everyone who reads this will ask himself, what might have been had Atta missed his flight? And the book, that's how it starts, and it talks about these little snippets about what people remember. But his main point is, and it was the point you were making, we don't forget. We cannot forget this, because when you break it down, it's people. My favorite quote in here is from a British paratrooper. The man his name was Rick Rescorla, a former British paratrooper who was Vice President of Security for Morgan Stanley in the South Tower. Ignoring the Port Authority's assurance that the tower was safe, he said, I'm getting my people the F out of here. He saved hundreds of lives, but in the process, lost his own. I mean, it's little stories like that. I mean, this reviewer called it 64 fine sliced chapters. And so, like I say, I plan on being here Wednesday morning, and I just wanted, for those of you who will be here, just something to remember. It is at 11:45 hours, I believe. But anyway, yep.